It's gonna wait a couple minutes. I never want to wish time away, but.
Yeah. Can you even close for libraries?
What?
Yeah.
All right,
Or the For the last time in this program, my name is Jackson Hignite and I'm from Springdale, Arkansas. I am a MPP student concentrating in grassroots policy change. Before I begin, I want to thank my parents, Mike and Margie Hignite. You are both public servants in the truest sense of the word, and I'm proud to be your son. To Professor Pinheiro Shields, my advisor, your guidance the past 2 years has been invaluable. To my fiance, Lainan, and our son, Smokey Joe, thank you for supporting me every step of the way. Before we get started, I want to say we'll be dealing with some heavy stuff regarding racism and violence, so take care of yourselves however you need to. The title of my presentation is School Segregation in Sundown Towns, How to Unravel a Legacy of Hate. Like I said, I'm from Springdale, Arkansas, one of the very sundown towns we'll be talking about. First, I'll explain what sundown towns are. Then I'm going to tell you all a story of Springdale, a story of Arkansas, and a story of America that will bring us from Reconstruction to today and give us the policy context of both sundown towns and school segregation. Then we'll discuss my policy proposals, my analysis, and finally my recommendation. Sundown towns are towns that expelled ethnic and religious minorities through violence, intimidation, or economic exclusion. Most often, these were towns that excluded Black people, but also Chinese people, Japanese people, Mexicans, Native Americans, Jewish people, Sikh people, Catholics, Southern Europeans, union members, and queer people. The name Sundown Town comes from the common practice of putting up signs at the edge of town warning Black people to be out of town by the time the sun went down. At one point, these towns may have made up the majority of incorporated places outside the traditional South. Today, their history is well and intentionally hidden. I didn't know I came from a sundown town until I was 20 years old. There's a significant chance that you or someone you know is from a sundown town. This is where I'm from, the northwest corner of the Arkansas Ozarks. Do you see where you're from on this map?
Yes.
Reconstruction. The period immediately after the Civil War represented the first real shot at creating a multiracial democracy in America. For a number of reasons, white people went in the opposite direction. Just 1 year after the end of Reconstruction, Springdale, Arkansas is founded. From here, the sundown era begins. At this time, as Springdale is being founded, Chinese people are being expelled from towns across the Western occupied territories. Over the next several decades, this violent tactic would be applied to Black people nationwide. By 1901, when Springdale High is established, the Ozarks region is going sundown, as are many towns in the Midwest. As the rest of the nation is going sundown, Black Southerners are fleeing the terrorist regime of the Jim Crow South in what's called the Great Migration. By 1930, Springdale and sundown towns across the Midwest are industrializing, leading to labor disputes that often saw white workers violently push out Black workers. This violent movement forced rural Black people out of small towns and into large cities in what's called the Great Retreat. As cities grew increasingly Black, sundown suburbs were established to facilitate white flight from urban areas. After decades of organizing, Brown v. Board of Education overturns Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring that separate but equal has no place in public education. 10 minutes down the road from Springdale, Fayetteville, Arkansas announces a plan to desegregate 4 days after the decision. 3 years later and 3 hours south, desegregation remained a literal battlefield, a battle we are still fighting today. By 1968, the sundown era was coming to a close as the civil rights movement and America's second chance at creating a multiracial democracy was also coming to a close. After 1968, we see the commitment to desegregated schools and Brown v. Board rolled back. Starting in 1972, when San Antonio v. Rodriguez ruled there was no constitutional right to an education, and that discrimination against poor students was constitutional unless it was proven intentional. This paved the way for Milliken v. Bradley, which blocked mandating cross-district desegregation plans. Milliken similarly ruled that school segregation was constitutional unless it was intentional, effectively permitting de facto school segregation. De facto segregation, like we had in Springdale, where the schools were 96.96% white in 1989. Much like other sundown towns and suburbs, Springdale never had to deal with school desegregation because Springdale never desegregated. Without Milliken v. Bradley, maybe Springdale would have been forced to merge with Fayetteville's more diverse school district, but that didn't happen. 2 years later, the Supreme Court continues its attack on Brown, ruling that school districts can be released from their court-ordered desegregation plans even if doing so would lead back to de facto school segregation. It claimed that desegregation was a temporary remedy, not a permanent obligation. Meanwhile, Springdale and other sundown towns are desegregating rapidly, largely due to industrial powers providing plentiful, exploitative, and dangerous jobs to immigrant workers. By the time I was born in '96, Springdale's Latino population had tripled, and it was on its way to becoming the largest Marshallese community outside the Marshall Islands. And because we can't have nice things, in 2005, white people in power segregated the schools, drawing a line separating East and West. 2 years later, the Supreme Court put strict limitations on the use of race to achieve school diversity. So although the architects of the split in Springdale clearly used race to segregate the schools, the Supreme Court all but prohibited using race to desegregate the schools. Today, as more and more sundown towns like Springdale are desegregating or will desegregate in the coming years, public schools have been getting more and more segregated by race and class for 30 years straight, especially in the South and the West, and especially for Latina and Black students who are increasingly isolated in high poverty schools because the legacy of segregation lasts if you don't do anything about it. Both high schools in Springdale, for example, are majority minority and majority low income, but the legacy of the split still shows in the disparity between the two. Segregation cannot be ignored, it must be addressed, which brings us to policy proposals. My first is attendance zone boundary affirmative gerrymandering, which I will call affirmative gerrymandering because it's a mouthful, which takes school attendance zones and draws them to affirmatively achieve desegregation. It begins with crafting neighborhood socioeconomic status scores. This is one of the loopholes from the 2007 case that put restrictions on using race-conscious plans. These scores are based on things like race, household income, parental education, language proficiency, whatever measures of socioeconomic status are relevant to your community. Schools are then split into clusters of at least 2 and no more than 5 schools. Schools are assigned such that neighborhood SES scores are closely representative of both the cluster and district average. It also places caps on the concentration of low achieving students in a given school. Affirmative gerrymandering also allows limited choice within the clusters. Here's Springdale's elementary school zones. Do you see how there's a line going down the middle? Here's Springdale's high school attendance zones. It might be a little clearer. Affirmative gerrymandering would take this gerrymandering that segregates schools by race and proactively create more socioeconomically representative schools. And in smaller districts where maybe there's only 1 or 2 schools like you see here, affirmative gerrymandering would still be able to promote desegregation by creating one district-wide cluster and using neighborhood SES scores to assign students. My second policy, mergers and magnets, has 2 components. First, a sundown town proposes a merger with a nearby more diverse district. This process can be initiated by citizens. It doesn't have to start with elected officials. Second, this policy requires magnet schools be built in both districts to promote school and residential integration. This helps ensure the burden and rewards of desegregation are shared by both communities. For our policy analysis, we'll be looking at versatility, feasibility, accountability, and probability. Versatility answers the question, can this policy be applied to sundown towns of various sizes and demographics? Because some sundown towns are large and diverse like Springdale, while others have less than 1,000 residents and almost no people of color. Feasibility goes to whether a policy is cost prohibitive or otherwise unreasonable to implement. Accountability answers 2 questions. Will this create meaningful desegregation? And what accountability measures are provided to keep the policy in place over the long term? Probability asks, what's the socio-political probability this policy gets implemented and sustained over the long term? Because what we've seen is that it's not so much how many strategies you use to promote desegregation, it's whether the community is committed to desegregation over the long term. Because I'm concentrating in grassroots policy change, I have to go more into detail here because sundown towns, much like America, have a political power structure fully hostile to progressive change, like school segregation and many of the policies we've heard about today. To create any sort of transformational change in sundown towns or across America, you'll need to have significant power behind you in the form of a social movement. A prominent social movement scholar has this formula for calculating movement strength: worthiness times unity times numbers times commitment. I think he's missing something. I think he's missing leverage, the ability to withdraw your participation from a corporation, system, or institution and hinder its operations or fully shut it down. The cool thing about leverage is you can measure it. 50% of a workplace is the minimum you need to have serious leverage. 90% means you're strike ready. You have real definitive leverage. Take a breath. Jane McAlevey took this farther in her book that you should all read, that basically says workers don't just exist in a workplace, they exist throughout the community. She thought if you can build a wonk in these organizations and institutions in the community, you can build not just workplace power, but social power. I think she's on the right track, but not going far enough. I think if you can build wunk in these organizations, you can build leverage in these organizations. And if you can build a movement that's strike ready and has majority leverage in different organizations throughout the community, you have community-wide strength for transformational change, not just change in a single workplace or on the margins of policy. To bring it back to my criteria, as we look at these policies, what advantages or disadvantages do these policies present to movement building in support of these policies? Versatility. A study of 15,000 attendance zones found that all of them increase segregation relative to plans where you just send kids to the nearest school. 15,000 attendance zones, and every single one increased segregation relative to that. This can be implemented anywhere. Mergers and magnets, in order for that to be implemented, Sundown district must be reasonably close to a more diverse district, which just isn't possible for some towns, especially in the West. Affirmative gerrymandering is more versatile. It can be implemented anywhere. Increased transportation costs that come with affirmative gerrymandering are going to hit the majority of sundown towns, which are rural towns, much harder. And affirmative gerrymandering, unlike mergers and magnets, has no cost sharing measures. Mergers and magnets requires proximity between school districts and requires cost sharing measures. In addition, large districts receive more state and federal funding. So as both districts get bigger, they have more funding to shoulder the burden of the implementation. Mergers and magnets are more feasible. Affirmative gerrymandering is much less likely to achieve meaningful desegregation because it will not address cross-district segregation, which is the main driver. Additionally, it is fully up to elected officials if, when, and for how long it gets implemented. Mergers and magnets can be initiated by petition and has 3 institutional accountability measures, including the state and both partner districts. This policy also does address cross-district segregation, like that caused by sundown suburbs leaving Black urban areas. Mergers and magnets is more likely to create meaningful desegregation and has more accountability measures. Affirmative gerrymandering is up to elected officials. You need majority electoral support from the beginning to get it implemented, and then from then on, you can't lose a single election or you'll risk the entire thing being upended. With mergers, you've got a lower barrier to implementation. You can go around the elected officials to some extent in some states. You're going to have to win an election, but if you win it, you've then got the state, which approved the merger, and both districts who agreed to the plan invested in making sure the plan is executed and that everybody meets up to their commitments. All this to say, organizers are going to have an extended timeline to build that majority support we were talking about. Mergers and magnets is more probable, which brings me to my recommendation, mergers and magnets. We need cross-district solutions for cross-district segregation. Magnets are much more effective at driving integration than charter schools, which are segregationist institutions with too many problems to list on this slide. Furthermore, it leans into mutualism. It puts people back into struggle as suburban districts have to work with the urban districts they once abandoned, and rural sundown residents have to work with communities their predecessors prohibited from stepping in their towns after dark. It forces people to confront the reality that we need each other. Across America, sundown towns and suburbs like Springdale recently desegregated, are desegregating, or will desegregate in the coming years. We are going to get a third shot at reconstruction. We are going to get a third shot at building a multiracial democracy, and we need to be ready. Education professionals, advocates, and organizers in these communities must be prepared to fight for school desegregation, and beyond that, school integration, which, regardless of what the Supreme Court says, is not a temporary remedy, but a permanent social, political, and moral obligation. Thank you.
This was incredible. Like the way that you laid out the history was so easy to follow and just so powerful. And just thank you so much for this presentation. My question is, what are the systems or resources, if you know, that are in place to support students through the process of desegregating or integration? I immediately think of the Little Rock Nine and just like how much they must have gone through in their brave decision to go to these white schools with white folks yelling and you know, just being violent towards them. And I often think like what supports were in place or what supports could have been in place to help them with that transition.
Yeah, the Little Rock desegregation crisis was very complicated because So the story goes, you've got the Little Rock Nine who try to desegregate Central High. Then Governor Faubus calls in the National Guard, stops them from entering. Then President Eisenhower calls in the 101st Airborne and escorts the Little Rock Nine into school. And then the schools are desegregated. Ta-da. No, a year later, Governor Faubus and the state legislature implemented what's called massive resistance, which is a strategy often used in the South where elected officials would just close down public schools instead of allowing desegregated schools to exist. So it's something I want every white person to understand is that racism hurts white people too. Massive resistance is one of the best examples of that. They didn't care whether or not white kids got educated. They cared whether or not Black people got educated with white kids, right? As far as support structures, the local NAACP was a big one. They were doing constant organizing to protect the kids. The 101st Airborne was a big deal. Like if you have people with weapons to protect students bodily, that's an important measure, especially because one student tried to assassinate a member of the Little Rock Nine, which doesn't get talked about a lot. It has to be at every level of the community, which is why I talk about building leverage in every community organization. Because if it's a one-sided affair, you're going to lose. That's why people need unions, because if it's just you against the power structure, you're not going to win.
Yeah, so this was really great. Thank you so much. It was so well done. It was beautiful. So I've been working around the area of segregation and integration for a long time. And one of the challenges that we run into or have run into over time is actually selling it to parents and to young people. Segregation, as you know, now seems natural. So how do you sell it both, to the communities that need to be convinced that this is actually a good idea?
Yeah.
And then to your point, especially to communities of color where they may, I've often found that they don't want to go to school.
Yeah.
White people for a good reason. And so that's been a challenge for advocates, obviously, on the ground all over the United States. So how do you think about that? And my second question, if you have time, is this presentation is fantastic and it assumes that integration is a positive.
Yeah.
And so what do you see the benefits of integration?
Okay, so your first question was about how to sell it. And communities of color being resistant to interpersonally, you'll find a lot of examples of communities of color being resistant. That is largely due to the fact that during the first big push for school desegregation, the burdens of it were put almost entirely on Black people. Opinion polls will say that Black people are more likely to want desegregated and integrated schools than white people. And as far as selling it goes, I think you would be better served by being an organizer instead of an advocate, because like we've seen, like it's not about having the best argument, right? Like it's about how many people are committed to the project. So you have to go through the organizing practices that union members go through to organize a workplace, and you have to apply that to the community at large. You can't just make a good argument and expect people to buy into it. You have to do the slow, but faster than people think work of organizing and doing structure tests, making charts of who's in the community, making charts of who's in your workplace that hasn't signed on, all that good stuff. Yeah. As your second question was, right?
I forget what my second. Yeah, you assume that integration is a positive. I totally 100% agree with you, but like, why?
Yeah, we've got just boatloads of evidence that it's better for people. It's better for everybody to be in a desegregated school in terms of student achievement. It helps everybody and doesn't hurt anybody to have desegregated schools in terms of student achievement. I think if you are basing your argument for desegregation on student achievement, you're missing the forest for the trees. You're also setting yourself up for failure in the long term, because if you go through a period where maybe you're not getting state funding or federal funding and your schools are performing worse, people are like, oh, we have lower student achievement, desegregation wasn't worth it. And then you lose an election and you're back at square one. So I think part of it is kids do better. White kids are more likely to seek out integrated workplaces and integrated neighborhoods if they are raised in desegregated schools. So it makes white kids better people. But it's also about like, are we committed to having a multiracial society? Are we like committed to that ideological project, regardless of what the statistics say? Brandon, I saw you first.
Yeah, great presentation, Dex. Thank you. Wonderful work. And I'm always curious in these conversations about schools and as far as like the role of the teacher.
Yeah.
So I'm curious what you see is the role of teachers in this space and teachers unions.
That's a great point. I wrote about this in my paper. Any serious social movement committed to school desegregation is going to focus on school unions first. Now, obviously, that's going to include teachers, but we've seen in red states like West Virginia, where teachers have remained committed to unionizing the entire school. They've remained committed to support staff like bus drivers, like custodians. They've been able to build more leverage by including more people in that unionization process. And they've been able to force through policies that the legislature and the governors just had no intention of passing. I think if you're going to try and get your schools desegregated, it has to start with teachers. It has to start in the schools. We've also seen students play a big role in sundown towns, lead their town through the desegregation process, become leaders of like creating a more integrated society. But it's got to be intentional. You have to prep your students for that, because we've also seen students that just abuse their classmates of color, and you have to make sure you avoid that as well.
Yes, again, amazing. I think this is a very complicated issue that you have broken down so beautifully with visuals and walking us through.
I'm so glad it worked. That was very good.
So just to follow up on that, because teachers, I think, are playing an important role, but particularly in those red states, we are seeing that classroom become a battleground, right? Teachers are losing their jobs for showing statues of David, right? Pictures of statues of David. So there are so many other things. They're not allowed to even say the word gay. Like it's just becoming so polarized that adding one more thing to a teacher might seem like too much, because they're already navigating these really complicated, with the governor getting involved, the school board getting involved, and parents getting involved. And so I wonder, how might you see this issue fold into some of those other issues they're fighting, so that they are more collectively fighting against kind of all these things, and it doesn't feel like they're so shattered.
Yeah, for sure. I think, forgive me if this is a little too explicitly Catholic. I think doing good things makes you a better person. I think if you are engaging people in the fight for desegregation, they are more likely to engage in the fight against trans discrimination, like we're seeing in Florida. I know a lot of teachers back at Mount High School who are like hate the sin, love the sinner type people who are not going to fight against trans discrimination, but because they've been put into the role of teaching students of color, they are very likely to fight against school desegregation because they've lived the fight with those people, right? Like doing good things makes you a better person, and it's more likely once you exist and struggle with people that you're going to stand up for them.
Again, I'm echoing everybody, but I'm just so impressed, and I feel like this is just at the convergence of like all of your policy interests, and it's like this is the most Jackson presentation in the world. Everyone else has such great questions, and I'm stealing one from earlier, but because you could like write a book on this, and I hope you do someday, I would totally buy it. I was just wondering if there was anything else in your paper that you feel like you didn't get enough time to talk about that you just want to expand on.
So the two reconstructions that I referenced, can I get it? Thank you. So the two reconstructions that I referenced ended because, as we've said, doing good things makes you a good person. Doing bad things makes you a worse person. There was a shot in both of these periods where there was a significant number of people who were committed to this idea of a multiracial democracy, right? white Northerners go west to avoid black competition. Like obviously there's racism because they're people in 1870s, they're white people in 1877, but a lot of them are motivated by fears of job competition and stuff like that. But as they move west, they wittingly or unwittingly participate in the genocide of Native Americans, and through that process, they are going to become less committed to multiracial democracy. You've also got xenophobic attacks on Chinese people in the West. You've got racist fears of sexual violence being promoted through propaganda nationwide. And most importantly, white people didn't stand up to the people spewing this nonsense, right? There's examples of sundown towns where it was created, it was made sundown by a mob of white people, right? And you've got examples of sheriffs taking this black person, risking their lives, and like smuggling them out of the town, right? White people can always stand up against racism, even if it's against people that seem more heavily armed, more heavily funded. You have the opportunity to stand in solidarity with black people at every single opportunity, and they didn't. In 1968, as the second Reconstruction is coming to a close, you've got a 5-year stretch of horrible political violence. It's not mind-numbing. In 1968, we've got Nixon at the culmination of this, after the Fair Housing Act is passed. Nixon develops the Southern strategy, runs on law and order explicitly against the civil rights legislation. He prolongs, sabotages peace talks, prolongs and intensifies genocide war in Vietnam, and appoints 4 Supreme Court justices that over the next 30 years just take bite after bite after bite out of Brown v. Board. And it's just, I don't think we've reckoned with the fact that Nixon, of all people, appointed 4 Supreme Court justices and defined the Supreme Court for 2 generations. It's obscene.
Yeah, so you're talking about your recommendation is these mergers and magnets. And you said that these are sort of, well, these were less adaptable, I think, in your analysis, right?
Yeah, because every school district has gerrymandering. They can just rewrite it to make it better.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. So I'm just thinking about, adapting to a very rural setting,
Yeah.
right? Because like I used to live in a place which I now know was a sundown town. And it's this huge county, very rural. Kids are already, there's 2 high schools and kids are already on the bus an hour and a half, 2 hours
Yeah.
every day just to get to high school, right? And so like, how do you see adapting this this plan to circumstances like that where, merging is going to make the school more inaccessible?
Yeah. In some cases it will, in some cases it won't, right? Like if you're a sundown town and part of your town is closer to that diverse community, those kids are actually gonna have an easier time in some cases. And you're right, this is gonna hit rural kids harder no matter what you do, because desegregation costs money, transportation costs money, and rural school districts can spend twice as much per student on transportation. And this is going to hit especially hard in places like Kentucky, which, as we talked about in our public finance class, Kentucky has a law that says it has to cover transportation costs for schools, and just doesn't. It just decided not to, which is going to hit rural schools harder. I think one thing to keep in mind is, like we were saying earlier, desegregation has to be an ideological project that we're committed to. It tens of millions of kids go to school every day through buses. You only see violent riots when it has to do with desegregation.
Just to piggyback on that, and you may not know this, but I wonder if you were to kind of plot it all out, are there communities that are sundown communities or segregated schools that are gonna like miss this because they're not close enough to another district to share with?
Yeah, for sure. And those communities can go through the process of doing deep organizing and making their community committed to desegregation by starting with affirmative gerrymandering, knowing that because they're like 10% people of color, they're not going to achieve like a desegregated school experience, but they can start that process so that people of color are more likely to move to this town, which still has the reputations to this day. We've talked about, some of us have talked about, there's a town in Illinois called Anna, ANNA, which stands for Ain't No N-Words Allowed. Why are Black people incentivized to move to this town if you don't have like a social movement of people that are saying, hey, we know this, we're trying to change the name, the name of this town sucks, and we are explicitly, proactively trying to make our town safe for everybody, especially Black people. You can go through that process, and not just can, white people need to go through that process in white spaces without especially when there's no people of color to lead the movement, right? It's our responsibility.
All right, thank
Go
you.
team.